A new portion of nonsense was delivered by dictator Putin about the war in Ukraine. Not a plan, but a concept. Trump made a statement about a peace deal. NATO said that the war in Ukraine could end by the end of this year. Military expert, Colonel of the Ukrainian Army Petro Chernyk is with us today. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.
For a week, the draft peace agreement is the #1 topic. And finally, in Russia they also started talking about this project. After the Collective Security Treaty Organization summit in Kyrgyzstan, Putin went to a press conference and made a bunch of statements from which it follows that he is not ready for peace or for a change in his positions, only for delaying negotiations. This is obviously his tactic that everyone will physically just get tired of the war. Is he preparing the further basis for ultimatums?
Definitely yes, and their ultimatums already exist in fact. If you look closely at his press conference, how he behaved, what he said, and sum it all up into one common denominator and one thesis, it is very simple: the war will continue. Everything we must take back by force, we will take back. Get out, first of all, of the 4 regions, because I remind you that they included our 4 regions into their constitution, and only then will we talk. That's the point, we will start talking only after that. We briefly reflected on everything that has just happened in terms of these so-called negotiations, 28 points, then 19 points. This is a truly extraordinary phenomenon.
He said that the project does not exist, and there were only issues that they were allegedly ready to consider in the future.
That's what we'll focus on and analyze. The only message I want to give to the audience. I have this type of mind, this type of analytics, that I try to analyze cold events. This is not a cold event, but it is no longer linear, it is too long in our information space.
It is like clay.
Yes, you can still sculpt from it. But we need to figure out at what point of this eternal existential war we are and why this gigantic negotiation process broke out, in which there is simply a lot of noise. And now there is such noise, louder than anything since the start of the war, especially the so-called Witkoff tapes, which are also a very unique phenomenon in terms of intelligence agency operations. So let's figure out where we are. And let's try to go beyond the negotiation process itself, because we have somewhat forgotten in all our analyses the fundamental reason for this war, why it all started in 2022. And I have to remind you. Russians made an attempt to restore their empire. Without Ukraine, in the broadest sense of the word, their quasi-empire cannot exist. They really thought that in just 2 weeks they could push us back, and then, as happened during the formation of the Soviet Union, the great civilized world would have nowhere to go from them. And indeed, the world did not go anywhere. Let me remind you, 1924 was the so-called parade of recognition of the Soviet Union, and in the 30s even the Americans recognized them, and then they also pumped them technologically twice, both during the Great Industrialization and during the Second World War, and then they traded very successfully. The war has gained a very large momentum and a large scale. The bloodiest war in Europe since World War II. And here we have discussed a lot. I refer to all our previous programs. The economic aspect, it is very important, it is extremely fundamental. We talked about sanctions, about oil, and about the added value arms race. And this is really such an important and fundamental point. The Russians have officially said that they are raising taxes significantly next year, very significantly. It seems small, but it's not. They really.
Are they running out of money?
Absolutely, and we also analyzed a phenomenon called their oligarchy. Unlike the relatively short capitalist period of the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, today the oligarchy is a very powerful force. They control up to a quarter of the country's resources: aluminium, non-ferrous metals, and grains and legumes, not the state but them. There is nothing worse than when ultra-rich people start losing, and they start to lose for real. And once again, let's leave out all the huge noises that are here. It was they who gave the signal to America like, let's look for some kind of compromise.
But they didn't win in this round.
In my opinion, no. The security forces are advocating for war. Maybe I will contradict myself because I always say their resources are going down. Strategic resources are really going down: good aviation, armored vehicles, artillery. But they put the missile, primarily the Kh-101 3M14 caliber, into production. They have 10 to 15 Tu-95 aircraft left, the youngest from 1994, lasting about 10 more years. Almost 100 million Kalashnikov assault rifles were produced. Of course, there are not 100 million in stock, but there are 37 million Mosin rifles. I could go on and on about what they have.
These are weapons, but mundane things like refueling these planes.
They still have enough to last. We will talk that there is a collapse in the oil part as well. But they still have a lot of soldiers dying on the battlefield. That's a great pity. They can still put up to at least 1 million men in service. Plus this year they have a unique phenomenon. For Putin, they created an unlimited resource, practically an endless draft. Before, they had 2 cycles, spring and autumn. Now it can be almost continuous. In my personal view, the power faction won this round over the oligarchy, though I could be wrong. That's why all of this boiled over so strongly, why they were triggered. If we take the negotiation process as such a kind of sine wave, then the first outbreak was back in June 2022 in Istanbul. There we won a diplomatic victory. Because it didn't go as they wanted. Second, Anchorage. And I am inclined to those analysts who say that Putin had better conditions then, he could have exited the war on better terms for himself. Now there's another, very intense flare-up. We have just outlined that 2 large groups that are in opposition to each other have indeed already crystallized. But there is a very serious nuance, and I will be honest, I do not have such a clear specific answer to this question. The first who really understood and saw this problem was Winston Churchill. I really like to quote him, so now I will quote him again. The struggle for power among the Russians is like bulldogs fighting under a carpet. You can only see who won or lost when they pull out the bones of the loser. So something is definitely happening there now at a high-pitched tone that hasn't been seen before.
Can this process be accelerated? For example, after Putin's statement, the Russian stock market reacted very clearly.
It went down.
Shares of leading companies fell, they lost 100 million rubles.
Definitely, and I think they will continue to lose. Moreover, in my personal view, after the failure of this round for the Russians, because we actually won it, I must note something very interesting. Perhaps for the first time, the Europeans have so consolidated, focused, and systematically stood in support of us. If you look closely at the Geneva negotiations that took place, everything was really so boiling, so acute that the Americans were about to walk away from the process. And it's all thanks to Marco Rubio. That's really good too. The American side is also very complex. There are 2 very powerful wings there. Marco Rubio represents the hawks who advocate for America's exit from isolation. And then there are J.D. Vance and Witkoff, who only look inward. And here's a quick note for our viewers. In January, the congressional elections effectively start in the US. Our Ukrainian issue is very important in American society, and the political sphere has also become radicalized, showing that a solution must be found, but in this round, none was. What does this mean? Putin stated, "We will continue to fight, negotiations are impossible." There must be a response from the Americans. They have already responded to Lukoil and Rosneft. The stock market has gone down. This means there should be the next step.
What can it be?
We have already said that there are endless huge tools for real sanctions. And I just dream of that moment to get up one morning and read the following news. A number of strategic goods of the Russian Federation have been embargoed. An embargo is a ban on purchasing. Not just a decrease in the price of oil. It won't fall below $30 to $35. Because American shale oil, they are now number 1 in the world in oil production. Yes, the Americans managed to do it. But there is a forest, 82 million cubic meters of reserve. It's just something gigantic. There are legumes. This year they have a huge harvest. There are mineral fertilizers, they are among the top 5 in ammonia production. At the end of its existence, the Soviet Union produced 28 million tons of ammonia. This is a gigantic amount, and this is not all, including artificial rubber. So there really is a place to cut these strings. But there is also interesting news. I'll guess what you want to say. There's assets which are actually frozen. In fact, no one has gotten close to them yet.
140 billion euros. The European Commission is already planning how to use the money.
Exactly. And no one has really gotten to them yet. That's a lot of money. And if the Europeans are in favor of American sanctions, it will all happen together. Or perhaps contrary to that. Why not?
Have you noticed Putin's reaction, how he said about these sanctions?
Yes, he reflects. There's already pressure from those who caused the flare-up. Money, money, and more money. Because a person is built like that.
What was he hinting at when he said, if they introduce new sanctions and take away our Russian assets, there will be an appropriate reaction? What is it?
He unleashes a real wave of fear because aside from a few potential missile strikes toward Europe and possibly some drones or major infantry resources, nothing left. So he raises the degree of fear. But again, it seems to me that it is in a bubble. He no longer understands reality. He never understood from the start, misled into thinking Ukraine could fall in weeks. I reflected on your remark, but still I will return to what is called money. The resource is great, it is very interesting. And this, if it happens, will be an unprecedented phenomenon, taking money from a single state. And here there are really certain fears. I have no doubt that Russian agents on that side are working very actively because they could trigger a mechanism even in civilized, law-abiding Europe that would alarm all the so-called global financial and industrial groups. So I wouldn't say that it will happen tomorrow. But the fact that there has been a serious movement in this direction is definitely true. So, if we were to try to reduce all this hot steam, as we'll call it, of the negotiation process to some kind of logical analysis, I would draw several conclusions. The first and most important one. Most important, I will talk about this endlessly. Russians do not give up fighting for us. This is very fundamental, it is fact. Vasil Klyuchevsky, their imperial historian around the 19th-20th century transition. For the rest of my life, I will repeat this phrase with one exception: if I live to see the moment that Russia dies as a state. Russia is a threat to Ukraine, Ukraine is a threat to Russia. One will be left. This is the first fundamental conclusion. You ask the question so correctly that Europeans are talking about the end of the war. But there will be no ending. Only the end of this phase of hostilities is possible. If Russia remains as it is, the question of the next historic military strike is only a matter of time. Now let's localize it to a narrow part, this so-called negotiation calendar. For the first time, we subjectively, very qualitatively, very intelligently, together with the Europeans, almost radically replayed the plan that the Russians launched, in general, into life, into discussion. And the third conclusion is also no less important, very serious. General strategic economic prerequisites for narrowing the field of the oligarchy's feeder, and also war, because war is money, money and more money. Money is in our favor. But I have to move a little away from the big geopolitics and move into the reality of the battlefield. Winter is on the agenda. And we must understand that winter is in our favor because the enemy is in the state of the attacking side. And this infiltration tactic, using just one or two fighters, since they abandoned company-level assaults and battalion-level attacks aren't seriously considered at all, is now undergoing revision. Why? We understand very well, for a soldier in full gear, with a rifle, grenades, water, ammunition, and so on, to run across a dry field is one thing, but to cross it when it turns to mud and you sink above your knees is something different. Therefore, they reflect correctly, and, in my opinion, the next round is possible no sooner.
So they will drag out until the end of winter.
Right. I return to the analysis of the Americans. The American election race starts. And you know, I'm being a bit ironic. My heart as a Ukrainian is torn for the fact that we are paying such a huge price for our independence because we are fighting for independence. This war is nothing more than a delayed war of independence. But let's put aside a little emotion and look at the process with cold, cynical eyes, because geopolitics is a cynical thing. It is a struggle for world power. And when in our history we, as a state and now as a subjectivized nation, were so tonally important on a planetary scale that the domestic policy of the world hegemon of the United States was built around Ukraine. Let's be honest, this is a historical phenomenon. Now all of us Ukrainians need wisdom, patience, and resilience to maintain this phenomenon and finally break free from this disgusting Russian influence. I honestly can't find a metaphor for how vile they are to us, and truly begin moving toward the normal, civilized European, Euro-Atlantic world where, I emphasize, our place and our mission truly are. Last time we reflected on France, it was such a small touch because there we clearly analyzed and talked about how the French sigh in the direction of the Russians. But let me remind you that the constitution of Philippe Aulic was implemented in the French constitutional process by his son Rihor Aulic, who was in the service of Louis XV, and after the Great Bourgeois Revolution, it was our basic documents that became the prototype of the constitutional process in democratic Europe. That's exactly how it was. We have something to offer the world.
Petro, I want you to analyze another signal that has come from Washington. There is no exact time frame for the conclusion of negotiations on the points of the peace agreement. Trump said this when he was asked by reporters about the peace agreement on board the plane. And earlier, it was said that by Thanksgiving in the United States, which is the 27th of November, the negotiation process will be completed, and even, possibly, an agreement will be signed. By the way, Trump clarified that his special representative Witkoff will go to Moscow in early December for talks and to meet with Putin.
We'll see if he still gets there. This is also all very difficult. But I would reflect on the fact that Trump spoke the way he did, especially that there was a strict deadline, a specific one, they named the date. That's how it should be. After the fact that everything has already boiled over, after what Putin said, at this moment I do not see a single breakthrough moment that Witkoff's visit to Putin can make and what they will talk about there. In my view, there will be another clarification of positions regarding those reflexes, the fog, the eruption of the negotiation magma that actually occurred. That's what will happen. And realistically, my personal opinion, something should really happen sometime in February or March, with one exception. If some really strong group in Moscow resorted to another palace coup, because palace coups are an acceptable phenomenon for the Russian state, starting from Elizabeth Petrovna, who carried out the first palace coup, Alexander the Great agreed to the painful murder of his own father, ending with the Bolsheviks. This is how they are arranged. And in fact, I will reflect as a citizen, as a person. I wish strength to those people who dare to do this. But there is one more aspect to this. Russian democracy, I will reflect on this, which does not exist in nature, ends exactly where the Ukrainian question begins. Again, back to the basic topic. We only truly exhale in this existential war when they fragment. Other scenarios do not exist in nature. Everything else is just intermediate moments and the next stage of preparation.
Petro, we have discussed the draft peace agreement proposed by the United States, but for its part, Europe is also proposing a draft agreement. There are fewer points, but they also come out with proposals, and these proposals should be taken into account, they say, in this particular peace agreement from the European Union.
The Europeans reflected correctly. They did not put forward something new. They took the American plan, revised it, removed the most toxic principles and conditions for us that the Russians demand, and this is supposedly a European document. But I do not share the point of view that this is something completely new which comes out of the general paradigm. Once again, and probably somewhere, we will put an end to this gigantic complex emotional analysis. The reflection took place. This is a sign that a great tectonic movement has begun inside Russia. The question is how this great tectonic movement will be and when will it end. I know very well that the audience wants to hear at least some specifics. If we consider this war as a unit of time, we are now approaching the 4th year of the war, so we have definitely passed the halfway point. I'm sure of it. We definitely crossed the half. What percentage? 65, 70, 85? It's very difficult for me to say, but we are rather closer to finding some real formula. And indeed, realizing that there is no solution to destroy Russia, and, in my opinion, there will be none, somewhere it would be really good for us to have a large peacekeeping contingent. I mentioned Cyprus. But let's not forget the Chinese.
The Turks made a statement that they are ready for peacekeeping contingent?
That's great. The more countries present in this peacekeeping contingent, the better. And it would be good for the Chinese to be present as well. As Otto von Bismarck said, a signed document with the Russians isn't worth the paper it's written on. There might be provocations toward other countries, but there will never be any provocations against the Chinese from the Russians. Of course, there will be smart people who will say, how can we let the Chinese into our territory? But if we proceed from the categorical imperative that there is no better formula in sight right now, then this is probably the way out.
Petro, we have already talked about Europe. Why is the composition of negotiators not expanding? After all, it is not only about security guarantees for Ukraine, but also about the fact that the role of the EU and NATO in regional security must be somehow preserved.
Let's figure out what the role of the EU and the role of NATO are. First of all, the role of NATO. What is this? NATO, let's be honest, 80% is the United States. Whether we want it or not. Yes, indeed, the US essentially compelled the Europeans to mobilize major military forces. This is a fact. They increase the percentage of their own GDP for defense companies receive orders. We have already analyzed all this. I will also reflect on your thesis. Security guarantees. And what are security guarantees? Do we have the security guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum? Yes. It would seem that the great powers of the world guarantee us immunity and sovereignty. So what? One of the states that guaranteed this, which is a member of the UN Security Council, violated this right. And here again I will speak very harshly in the part of the so-called 5th article of NATO, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. And from the point of view of common sense, I emphasize common sense, the attack on them has already taken place. If even 10 minutes of a MiG-31 was in their airspace, this is a military precedent. Yes, they did not use means of fire damage, but there should have been a reaction. And most importantly, we will give Ukraine something like this article. And what is it? Who has really tried NATO for strength, whether it is working or not working? The Russians gave a little nibble.
What security guarantees are we talking about?
I will express, in my opinion, what would be the right guarantees, but they will be very specific in my expression. 500 aircraft of all classes, 500, no less. We have already analyzed the Rafale deal, we have already analyzed the Gripen deal. It's great if at least one F-35 regiment appears. A regiment is 40 units. It is great if at least one division of the Typhoon installation appears. Typhoon is a Tomahawk. 4. So, for one division to appear and 500 missiles to it, I emphasize, no less. Until now, we don't have a good helicopter. We already have a confirmed case of an UH-60 shooting down Shard with a 6-barrel minigun. And what prevents a whole regiment of such helicopters from being delivered? And I can bend my fingers for a very long time. to the AGM-158 JASSM missile, which can strike up to 900 kilometers. I draw your attention. Important, there are more than 5,000 of these missiles in stock. In my understanding, a real guarantee is as many high-quality, serious weapons as possible. Indeed, I have serious, competent, intelligent opponents. I bow my head to you, friends, who say that the 8th physico-technical revolution, that is, the drone, has entered our lives. Everything along the front line is happening through drones. I agree. But this is not thanks to, but in spite of. Because not a single drone, dozen, 2, 3, 5 can replace the salvo of the Atacams division when conditionally 8 heavy missiles with a warhead of 200 kilograms fly and grind into dust, say, some railway junction. So, in my understanding, real guarantees are a large number of weapons. And the second good guarantee. We discussed the peacekeeping contingent, the front line. Macron is correctly reflecting in this direction, and the British are already reflecting correctly in this direction. And conditionally, if all our so-called auxiliary forces, we understand that we are guarding bridges, we are guarding power plants, we are guarding logistics hubs. And even, I know that it may sound ridiculous, patrolling the streets.
They are ready to provide military support.
It would be right if these three components were formed, a peacekeeping contingent, as much high-quality, heavy weapons as possible, and to free our human resources from the logistical functions that we are currently performing on our own, with the help of Western countries. My dream is a triangle of Great Britain, France, Germany. There is a huge problem with the Germans because they are very heavily demilitarized. But a quadrangle or even the replacement of the Germans with the Swedes would really be a very correct move. And I insist that it must be old Western Europe, because with the countries on the perimeter, not to mention Hungary, but with the Poles, things are far from the best either. In 1920 there was an agreement between Petliura and the Poles. Indeed, they fought the Bolsheviks. But if you study this history in great detail and properly, we saved Poland from the Bolsheviks with our own blood as such, and then they concluded the so-called Riga agreements with the Poles. This is what I think.
I would like to talk to you about another topic. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte expressed his vision of the end of the war. He believes that the war can be put to an end by the end of this year. He gave a lot of interviews this week, including to the Spanish publication El País. He said that even if a peace agreement is signed to end the war, Russia will remain a long-term threat for a long time. Before that, Rutte shared his opinion with a Radio Liberty journalist about the main meaning of the future peace agreement. Could Rutte's public optimism about the end of the war be part of a diplomatic strategy or pressure on Russia?
Definitely yes. But I still share the second part of his statement that Russia will be an endless threat as long as they are what they are. We need to look not only in the direction of their elites, Putin, but we need to look at the ethnos itself. All their elites are a reflex of their ethnicity. They are such by nature. Again, I will reflect on the words of Dostoevsky. Russians are very religious people. Before they cut you down, they will cross themselves. It would seem that this quote has nothing to do with reality, but in fact it has. So it is necessary to solve the problem of Russian statehood itself. In the form it is all presented, I do not have the slightest optimism that there can be something real before the new year. Although, again, the phenomenon of chance that at one point everything can coincide in a way that we may not see it now, I also do not forget. A specific historical example. We analyzed that oil brought down the Soviet Union, along with the arms race. But there were two other phenomena, Chernobyl and the earthquake in Armenia, which ate up enormous amounts of money. Can a black swan fly in from the side where we can't see it? Yes. But black swans arrive in the universe in the way and as it should be, that there are cause and effect relationships. We just don't see them. Nothing is taken from anything as a phenomenon. The only thing about Rutte, it's really good that we have already said that the Europeans have really become a consolidated force in our support this time. So now the Secretary General really says what he has to say. Conventionally, 2 or 3 years ago, such a statement by a person of such rank seemed unrealistic. And this is a fact. So there is a colossal shift in the minds of Europeans.
It is obvious that there is consolidation within NATO itself, because I think that they already have mechanisms to deter Russia.
Again, a tiny touch. The Germans, Merz in the first place, despite being demilitarized, have already in fact strengthened their army, putting into service rare information from open sources, I emphasize, up to 70,000 people. For the Germans, this is something groundbreaking.